No IMF loans, no USAID funds, no European consultants. And yet, in the heart of the Sahel, a new blue line now cuts through dust-colored earth. From satellite height, Burkina Faso is a mosaic of ochre and rock. But as the camera descends over the Bama Plains, something interrupts the drought, a silver ribbon of water traced by earth movers and the hands of local crews. The opening claim is bold, the longest irrigation canal project of its kind, now underway in Africa, built in just 8 months, powered by domestic labor, domestic equipment, and a domestic will that refuses to wait for permission. This story does not begin with budgets. It begins with water. For decades, Burkina Faso's greatest threat was not an army on its borders, but the retreat of rainfields, abandoned youth, leaving villages drifting into silence. In this context, a canal is more than concrete and flow rate. It is policy in motion. By moving water, the state moves people back into production, pulling abandoned land into the economy and sovereignty back under national control. I call this engineering independence, the deliberate choice to build critical infrastructure without external debt or foreign oversight. It is a high-risk path, maintenance siltation, seasonal variability, but risk-owned is different from risk outsourced. When a nation designs digs and governs its own water, it governs its own future. This film begins at that line of water across the Bama Plains, 160 hectares of rice, 70 hectares of vegetables, and a wager that in the Sahel, political freedom flows first from hydraulic freedom. When the world speaks of Burkina Faso, it often speaks of conflict. The headlines describe insurgencies, coups, and instability. But on the ground, the most persistent enemy has never carried a rifle. It has been drought. For decades, Burkina Faso has fought not against armies, but against the sky itself. With no coastline and rainfall that shrinks each year, over 70% of its people depend on land that cracks before it yields. The country loses thousands of hectares annually to desertification. When the rains fail, so do the harvests. And when harvests fail, dependence begins on food imports, on foreign aid, on promises wrapped in humanitarian logos. That is why President Ibrahim Traoré often says, "Security is not only about guns, it is about water." And he is right. True sovereignty begins when a nation controls its hydrology, its rivers, canals, and reservoirs, because whoever controls water controls food, and whoever controls food controls peace. The international community often misreads Africa's crisis as political. In reality, it is ecological and economic. You cannot stabilize a state whose farmers wait for clouds that never come. You cannot preach democracy to people whose wells are dry. Burkina Faso's new canal project is therefore more than irrigation. It is a strategy for survival and autonomy. While other nations arm themselves with weapons, this one has armed itself with water. In this light, the Bama Plains project is not simply infrastructure. It is resistance. Resistance against dependency, against despair, and against the long-standing narrative that Africa must wait for help to dig its own future. Water, not war. That is the true front line of Burkina Faso's revolution. The Bama Canal project did not begin with a foreign grant or a consultant's PowerPoint. It began with a sketch drawn by local engineers on a chalkboard inside an old agricultural office near the Koo River Basin. From that modest beginning came what is now being called the longest, locally built irrigation canal in Africa. Stretching across the Bama Plains, the project covers roughly 260 hectares of rice fields and 70 hectares of vegetable plots built entirely with domestic labor and equipment. In just 8 months, excavators, welders, and farmers worked side by side, not under the flag of an aid agency, but under the flag of Burkina Faso. No IMF supervision, no USAID procurement contracts, no EU consultants earning 6-figure salaries to tell Africans how to move their own soil. This time, every meter of trench dug was a statement. We build what we need, and we own what we build. Over 70% of all materials came from inside the country. Recycled steel, concrete from local quarries, and machinery refurbished in military workshops. Instead of hiring foreign surveyors, Burkina's young technicians mapped the entire irrigation route using open-source GIS tools and experiment in technological self-sufficiency. Some may call it small, even primitive, but to those who understand the cost of sovereignty, it is monumental. This is what I call engineering independence, when a nation decides that progress is not imported, but constructed one brick, one canal, one dream at a time. The canal is not simply a feat of civil engineering. It is an act of political engineering, drawing new lines of ownership across old colonial maps. When President Ibrahim Traoré visited the site of the canal, he didn't stand behind a podium. He stood on the wet clay itself. Reporters expected a speech about infrastructure. What they heard was a lesson in independence. Water is freedom, he said, because a nation that depends on others for food will forever depend for its dignity. That sentence traveled further than the canal itself. It framed the project not as irrigation, but as ideology, a visible line of resistance flowing through the Sahel. Each cubic meter of water represents more than crop yield. It represents the return of ownership. For decades, Western-funded projects like the FSRP, or MCC Compact, promised modernization, but carried hidden debts, foreign oversight, and data extraction. Many succeeded briefly, then stalled once the consultants flew home. Burkina Faso's approach reverses that equation. By building with its own hands and gold-backed funds, it keeps both the water and the will within its borders. The government calls it sovereignty in motion, the act of translating self-reliance into something you can touch, measure, and harvest. Critics in Western media see a political message. Citizens see something simpler: proof. Proof that development need not be outsourced. Proof that Africans can build, maintain, and innovate without surrendering control. And that is the deeper symbolism of the Bama Canal. It doesn't just channel water, it channels pride. It redraws the boundary between charity and capacity, between dependence and direction. In this sense, the canal is not only a structure, it is a mirror reflecting the nation Burkina Faso chooses to become. 8 months after the first dig, the Bama Canal no longer looks like a project, it looks like a living artery. The fields that once cracked under heat now shimmer with the reflection of water. Rice stalks bend under their own weight. Vegetable gardens stretch beyond the horizon. But the real harvest is not just food, it is work, skill, and hope. Over 3,500 direct jobs were created during construction, and more than 12,000 indirect livelihoods have followed: masons, welders, truck drivers, and food vendors. The project became a school, a national apprenticeship in self-reliance. Vocational centers have opened near Bama, training hundreds of young engineers in irrigation design, pump maintenance, and soil hydrology. For the first time, Burkina Faso is producing its own irrigation specialists instead of importing them. Each student that graduates carries not just a certificate, but a conviction that African hands can design African futures. Economically, the impact is already visible. Rice imports from Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire are falling. Local cooperatives are forming to process, package, and sell produce regionally. For many families, farming is no longer a gamble on rain. It's a profession. The canal didn't just bring water, one farmer says. It brought us back to life. And that is the unseen power of infrastructure built from within. It doesn't just irrigate soil, it irrigates confidence. Every flowing stream reminds citizens that development is not a product of permission, but of participation. The Bama Canal has become a classroom, a factory, and a symbol proof that when a nation believes in its own capacity, it can turn dry ground into destiny. When the first drone footage of the canal was released, international media reacted with disbelief. How could a landlocked country with one of Africa's lowest GDPs build such a project without loans? Asked one Western analyst. Others called it unsustainable populism. The skepticism followed a familiar pattern. Every time an African nation succeeds outside the orbit of donors, the headlines change tone from progress to concern. They question the data, the durability, the competence. But rarely do they question why dependency is always the benchmark of credibility. Burkina Faso's response has been calm but firm. "Judge us by our harvests," said a government spokesperson, "not by your headlines." That single sentence captured the country's new diplomatic posture: pragmatic, confident, and unbothered. Yes, there are challenges. Maintenance costs, sedimentation, and water sharing between regions all pose real risks. But the state has already begun expanding local cooperatives to manage upkeep, using profits from the harvest itself. It's not a perfect system, but it's a sovereign one. Meanwhile, many of the same organizations that doubted the canal are now quietly requesting technical reports, seeking to understand how Burkina Faso achieved in 8 months what years of consulted development could not. Because in the end, the Bama Canal is more than infrastructure. It is a case study in what happens when a nation dares to fail on its own terms, rather than succeed under supervision. And in that defiance lies its greatest strength: determination, not dependence. When the rains return each season, the canal swells like a pulse, feeding fields, yes, but also feeding faith. Across the Sahel, farmers now speak of water with a new vocabulary, not as mercy, but as mastery. This is what revolutions look like when they're built with shovels instead of slogans. They said Burkina Faso was too poor to build alone, one young engineer remarks. We proved that poverty ends when dignity begins. This is more than a canal. It is a declaration. A river that feeds not only crops, but consciousness. And in the red heart of the Sahel, Burkina Faso has taught the world one quiet truth: freedom, like water, must be drawn by your own hands.